Hi, good morning, everyone. How's everyone doing today?
Doing all right. It's a bit rainy and gloomy.
Yeah, it is. It's a sad day. I mean, it's nice because it's a good day for napping, which the rest of my family is doing right now, so they're lucky. Um, all right, so today we are covering, as the sort of screen shows you, it's a plastic ocean. So we're going to be doing I think a class you guys will like quite a bit. It's called the Plastic Ocean. So we're going to be talking about plastic. It's a pretty cool class. Before we go on, you guys had your exam on Tuesday. Overall, it went pretty well. I graded them all this morning, and you should be up to date on all your grades at this point in time, unless you turn something in within the past half hour. So definitely take a peek at your exam. Overall, I was pretty happy. And I think the average was around a 90 or in that ballpark. So it was pretty good. One thing I will just recommend checking sometimes, like when I'm typing your grades into, because I grade it like on a per question basis, and so sometimes I'm typing in like scores for a question, I'll type in like 15, but it only will register like one of the numbers. So just check in, look at your grade, see if it makes sense, and if something doesn't make sense, please just let me know. Because again, sometimes Blackboard just glitches and I'll type 15 and you'll get 5 or 1. And if there's no comments explaining why you got a 5 or a 1, then clearly something went wrong. So definitely take a peek at that when you have a second. From there, so we're covering plastics today, and we have 2 documentaries to watch with one another or by yourself. It's really up to you guys. I'll let you come to that choice at the end of sort of talking about class. So again, we'll talk about that at the end. And then next week we'll cover climate change on Tuesday. It's a long lecture, so just let you know we're covering a lot of stuff with climate change. It's the most important issue of the semester, so buckle up. It's going to be about a 2-hour ride. It's a long ride to get through climate change. And then only other things that are coming up that you need to be worried about are your backyard biodiversity lab is due. We'll talk about that in just a second. You have another podcast discussion board, and you have another lab which we'll talk about in just a moment as well. Now, the backyard biodiversity lab is the most sort of pressing one, I guess. Has anybody had a chance to collect your data and did you run into any questions, any concerns, something didn't make sense? It's a very simple lab. If you're working by yourself, you can ignore any questions that say, hey, what does your group say? Just say I'm working by myself. But basically, you're looking at how urbanization affects your sort of biodiversity in your backyard, right? So in theory, something that's close to your house is far more urbanized than something far away from your house. So the idea is you can compare what is living near your house or to what is away from your house, and you can readily see the effects of urbanization. Now, there's a literally kind of a cool thing about urbanization. It does bring in lots of species with it. And so if you guys have had a chance to read the handout, you'll know that oftentimes because people bring in wild species and exotic species, oftentimes urban environments are actually more diverse than the natural counterparts, which is kind of a weird thing to think about. But it actually ends up being the case because, if you guys have ever been if you have gardens at your house or your friends have gardens, you'll notice they have like tons of different flowers and trees and bushes. And most of these aren't even found in Massachusetts or New England. They're brought in from elsewhere. So it's kind of a cool thing. So you will see that effect, but again, you should see a pretty strong, or maybe you won't see any effect at all of your house versus natural environments. Now, I'm assuming most of you probably live in the New England area. There's nothing you really need to worry about in terms of creepy crawlies. Nothing can really hurt you. You're not going to find any black widows or anything like that, so you don't need to worry about that. But if you do live elsewhere, say you live, I have a student that was in Spain. In my other section of this, I had another student that was in Dubai. So if you live elsewhere, just be very careful, just in case you stumble on a creepy crawly that can hurt you, or maybe if you live someplace like Australia where things can kill you. So just be very careful outside of the New England area. Like for instance, if you live in Arizona, just be careful because Arizona's got lots of stuff that can kill you. Well, not lots of stuff. It has some things that can kill you, but that's a product of the desert. So a couple of questions I get commonly asked about this lab is, how do I deal with like grass you're kind of doing a ballpark. This isn't like a super accurate assessment. You're trying to get ballpark numbers. If you know, when you're looking at grass, you see, okay, there's like one type of grass here. Okay, that's fine. And you might ask yourself, oh, looks like there's thousands of blades of grass here. Yeah, that's probably true. You want to make a gross estimate. Oh, you know, on this transect that's 50 meters long or 50 feet long, oh, there's 10,000 pieces of grass, right? You're making coarse estimates. You're not trying to make any accurate assessments of numbers of things like that. Just let you know, you're not being super quantitative. You're trying to be qualitative, trying to get general patterns here. So when you're trying to decide if it's something's a species, if it's a slightly different color, you can probably have a fair bet it's probably different species. If you have a different size ant, you know, they're the same color, they're probably the same species. So basically what I'm telling you is use your best judgment. Don't go crazy trying to count all the things. Just try to get, a gross assessment of sort of what's going on in your backyard and then obviously relative to your natural site. The math that goes into it's pretty straightforward. You're doing some really simple calculations. You're calculating species richness, which is basically how many species do you have. And then you calculate something called species evenness. It's the second column in the table. Basically, you divide the number of times an individual occurs divided by essentially the total number of observations. So if I have an individual that occurs 5 times and I have 50 observations of species, 5 divided by 50 is obviously what 10%. So it has a value of like 10%. And evenness as a concept is kind of a weird thing to think about, but it's basically looking at the proportions of individuals in a community and how your data is spread evenly or not evenly throughout those communities. So the idea being, if I had 10 species and there was 10 and I had 10 species and I had 100 organisms total. If I had, say, 90 of them were one species and each of the remaining 10 species were found one time, we would consider that to be a very uneven community because, again, the observations are unevenly spread throughout my 10 species. Conversely, if I have a very even community, again, 10 species with 100 observations of those 10 species, if each species was found 10 times, that would be a perfectly even community. And so you can really get an idea of how even your community is do you have something that's really, really dominant, right? Do you have something that's 80% of your data, 90% of your data, 70% of your data, right? That would be a very uneven community. And you'll notice that when you start to calculate those 2 diversity indexes, so I give you, one's called Simpson's, not Homer Simpson. That would be funny. It's not Homer Simpson. It's just a scientist named Simpson. And I say it would be funny because there's a pathway in molecular biology called the hedgehog pathway, like hedgehog, like, the little creepy, little spiky guys. It's actually named after Sonic the Hedgehog. So it wouldn't be out of the realm of a scientist to name something after Homer Simpson. But this one was actually just named after the scientist whose last name was Simpson. So, and then there's another one called the Shannon Diversity Index, named after a scientist with the last name Shannon. Pretty cool dude. Well, never met the guy, but he did lots of really important research. So in my brain, he's a cool dude. And basically they're really similar calculations, but the Shannon index incorporates evenness. So one of your questions asks you, how do you think evenness affected your diversity? Well, when you start to think about mathematically how you calculated Shannon and how evenness factors in it, you really start to put the two together. I'm like, okay, if I have a very uneven community, it drives down my diversity. If I have a very even community, it pushes my diversity up. So it's kind of a cool thing. Those are sort of the main questions people ask me. Evenness, how do I count grass, things like that. Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody do the lab yet? As I saw, no one turned anything in yet, which is a-okay, obviously. So, yep, you had a question?
So just to clarify, for how to calculate the Shannon, that would just be calculating the evenness.
Well, let me actually just pull it up. Alrighty. This in the fall, I think. Backyard biodiversity. Hold on a sec. Google's got to do its thing. Load. Go down. Come on. So you actually calculate in this table here. I have a hypothetical example that I was working with, but you have species names. So if you had, say, dark, in this case, I give you dark green grass, light green grass, oak trees. Then you look at how many do you have. So I can have, say, in this case, I have 9999 So 9,999. Then we look at the proportion, which is PI, which is the total, which would be the end of the column here of 10,000 divided by how many times that species occurred. And then I get LNPI, which is the natural log. I'm sure you guys have probably seen a natural log at some point, but in Excel, it would just be like LN and then PI. That's just kind of how you calculate it. And then you'll see with Simpsons, you're calculating just the square, right? So you're just squaring ln of pi. And then you calculate Shannon diversity here, which is pi, which is just this column, times this column, so b times c. So the math is, when you do in Excel, you can just drag and, do the formulas once across and then just drag across. So it's relatively straightforward in terms of the math. That answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So, but if you have any questions along the way, definitely let me know. But it's way easier than you're thinking it's going to be if you haven't done the worksheet or if you haven't done the lab at all. It's very, very straightforward. Don't get all in your head of like, oh, this has got to be perfect. I got to get, no, just go out, spend 15 minutes on each transect, count stuff, do your data, fill in your tables, and answer the questions. It's not super difficult. It's not designed to be super difficult at all. So, all right. So that's the first lab. Now the second lab we have is actually tied in directly to what we're going to talk about today. It's just titled Plastics and Bioaccumulation. And so there's 3 parts to this lab. The first one is actually documentary. And it's I think it's a good documentary. It feels like it was shot in the 70s, but it was actually shot in the 2008, I think, or 2013. I don't know, somewhere in that time frame. But I get the vibe that it was shot in the 70s, even though it wasn't. And so there's this documentary. It's available on YouTube. It's about 40 minutes. It's a medical look at plastics. What are plastics doing to human biology? In particular, as you can sort of see the disappearing male, how it affects male biology, in particular, how it affects sperm, male reproductive capability. So it's a medical look at plastics. So that's the first part. And if you scroll down here, you'll see there's a worksheet. There's about, about 15 or so questions. Well, yeah, about 17 questions. There is 17 questions for you to answer on it. So it's a short documentary. You're doing this with a group, so you can watch it together. You can have one person do part 1, another person do part 2, and part 3, whatever you want to do. It's really up to you. And again, we can watch this together as class today if you guys want, but generally people prefer to just watch documentaries on their own. So I'll leave it up. I'll ask you guys at the end of the class what you'd like to do for the documentaries. Now, part 2 and 3 are bioaccumulation. Now, there's a little experiment for you to do. It's a pretty impactful experiment because it really shows you what this topic is. So we're going to talk about bioaccumulation today, but the idea is being that when a toxin makes it into the environment, it could be a mercury, it could be a plastic-based compound, it could be a carcinogen, any compound that gets out there. How does it become concentrated in nature? And when I mean nature, I mean, how does it become concentrated in tissue? So this little mini experiment gets at this idea. So the experiment relies upon you having water, which I'm sure you guys all have access to, cooking oil. They could be olive. Don't use fancy oils, right? Don't use like avocado oil or real olive oil or anything like that. Just use like basic garden variety vegetable oil. Like the stuff that's super cheap. So you need water, oil, and then you actually have to buy something. This is the only thing you ever have to buy for this class, but it's only about $3. So I was in Target the other day, and I was looking through the aisles just to make sure that you could still find it at Target, and you can find it on Amazon too, but Target's right down the street from me, and I was already buying coffee there, so it was seemed like an easy thing to do. But the idea being, when I look for iodine, it could be any kind of iodine. It can be, like one of the ones that says iodine plus something. It could be pure iodine, but just buy the cheapest thing that you can find that's brown and says iodine on it. And again, when I saw it at Target, it was about $3. You can find it on Amazon for very cheap, for like $4, $3, $2 sometimes. Don't buy fancy iodine. Don't buy a ton of iodine. Just buy a small amount of iodine, because as you'll see from this experiment, you need about 15 mils or about 3 teaspoons worth of iodine. That's really all you need. That being said, if you want to buy a bigger bottle of iodine, iodine is an absolutely fantastic antiseptic. It's what surgeons use. I'm sure you guys have heard of like when surgeons like clean areas that they're gonna operate on, they use betadine. That's just iodine bound to something else. I can't remember the name of it, whatever it's called. It's a great antiseptic. So if you want to buy some iodine, it's again great for cleaning cuts. It's one of the best antiseptics out there, and it's really hard to evolve resistance against. So like Clorox and bleach, bacteria can evolve resistance to. You can't evolve resistance to iodine. So just as a note. But the idea being is you're going to mix these three together. So you're going to have water, and that water is just going to simulate just water. You as an organism are a big bag of water, as I've sort of already mentioned, right? You're 70% water. You're just a bag of water walking on land. Then your oil that you're going to add, your olive oil or whatever oil you're going to use, simulates fatty tissue. And everything has fatty tissue. Doesn't matter how athletic you are. Everyone has fatty tissue. Just you need it, right? It's just an essential part of life. And then the iodine actually represents a toxin. Now, this case, it's going to be what we call a POP, or persistent organic pollutant. We'll talk about them today in more depth. But basically, you're going to simulate how bioaccumulation works. How does a toxin get into tissue? How does it stay in tissue? And how would that tissue be consumed by something higher than it, thus passing the toxin up the food chain? So again, I think it's a pretty cool experiment. Definitely let me know what you think. I'll ask you guys at the end of class, like end of the semester, see what you guys think. I think it's a pretty cool experiment, just to really show you some of the topics we're going to discuss today. And then we have the final part where you're actually going to do some math. And this is a new one for this class in particular. I've done it with other classes and it seems to be pretty successful, but this is actually basically doing the math behind bioaccumulation and biomagnification. So how do things get more concentrated as you go up the food chain? And so this table, it might seem a little bit complex at first, but trust me, it is very, very, very simple. I don't want you to worry about like spending hours on this table. It's very, very simple. We're going to walk through how you sort of calculate the bottom two rows, and then you can sort of go up and figure out the rest on your own or as a group. But the idea being we have 5 organisms here: orca, salmon, herring, zooplankton, and phytoplankton. So this is just a food chain, right? The orca's at the top, it eats the salmon and the herring. The salmon eats the herring eats the zooplankton, and the zooplankton eats the phytoplankton. And the phytoplankton are just like basically photosynthesizers, right? They're basically like trees. Then you have 2 columns. It has the lifetime accumulation of PCBs. So these are persistent organic compounds. And so these are toxins, essentially. That's just the way you got to think about it. You'll know more about a PCB in a few minutes when we talk about them. But you see that the phytoplankton passively absorbs, just from living in the water, 2 parts per billion per year. For over its entire life. You see the zooplankton does 2, the salmon and the herring both do 5, and the orca does 10. Now, a parts per billion, just to let you know, if I had 1 billion marbles and one of them was red and the rest were green, I would have 1 parts per billion red marbles. That's what parts per billion means. It's like, you guys have probably heard parts per million of CO2, right? It's the same idea, just parts per billion is an even smaller measurement. And these compounds are in very, very small quantities in nature, just as a note. So this is what the organism actively absorbs through its skin or through its membrane, if it's a very, very small thing, over its lifetime. And then you have what it eats. So for instance, the phytoplankton, it's photosynthetic. It doesn't eat anything. So we can start to calculate the total lifetime accumulation of these toxic compounds by actually just saying, okay, what's the sum of this column plus the sum of this column? So in this case, there's nothing in this column. There's 0. It doesn't eat anything, because if you're photosynthetic, you don't eat anything. And so you only are absorbing 2 parts per billion. So thus the total accumulation of the lifetime would just be 2 parts per billion for this phytoplankton. Then we move up the food chain where we see the zooplankton passively absorbs 2 parts per billion over its lifetime. So I factor that into my little equation here. So 2. Then it eats 100 phytoplankton. Now we take this 100 number and we actually multiply it by this number here below it, because we want to know, okay, if it's eating 100 phytoplankton, how much of this compound has the phytoplankton absorbed over its lifetime? And so we simply have 2. So we do 100 times 2, as you see in this little equation, which gives us 200 plus 2, giving us a total accumulation of 202 parts per billion. And then you just go up from there. So the next one would be 10,000. This guy eats 10,000 zooplankton. So we know how much the zooplankton eats, multiply that by 10,000, add 5, and then we have our number. And so we get bigger, and you'll notice right away, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until we get to the orca, where it's very, very, very concentrated. And actually, the funny thing about the orca is that by the time you get to it, parts per billion doesn't actually make sense for a unit anymore. You guys won't really care about that, but just to let you know, it gets so much concentrated that we would actually have to change units if we were actually trying to be accurate. So that's how that part works. It's very, very simple. You just have to factor in both columns here, and you have to factor in what it's eating. So if it's what it's eating is accumulating only 2 parts per billion, you factor that in. If it accumulates 202 parts per billion, you have to factor that in. And then from there, you just have a series of questions to answer based upon the video, based upon your little iodine experiment, and basically based on this table. So it's pretty cool set of experiments. I think it does a good job of I'll pat myself on the back. I think it does a decent job of really sort of highlighting how this works. These 3 processes of what the effects on human life are, how bioaccumulation works, and how toxins magnify in concentration up the food chain. So that's our final lab. Well, not together, but that you guys will do. Does anybody have any questions on what you saw? I mean, you have what 2 weeks to do it in that ballpark? I think so. I have to look back at the schedule, but you have at least a week to do it. So if you have any questions, definitely let me know along the way. But if you're thinking about the question and you think, oh, this is really hard, it's much more simple than you actually probably think it is. So, all right. So let me stop the share real quick because I have something for dramatic effect, because why wouldn't I? So as I've sort of mentioned, today we're going to be covering plastics. It's generally NASC 150's favorite class of the semester. Now, if we were doing this class in person together, we would actually dissect a bunch of stuff. So if you guys had taken with me in the fall when we would be in person, we would be dissecting fish and mussels and looking at plastics in bottled water. So it's a really fun lab. A lot of people don't like it because it stinks because you're cutting up dead organisms. But it is significantly better than the trash lab. People hate the trash lab even more because you have to sort through trash at Bentley, which is kind of a gross thing. But anyways, microphone. I put my camera back on just to show you, not to flex my sweet Amazon $10 gift card here, but actually as just a prop, right? So this is just a gift card. I've already cashed it in. It's plastic. Why am I showing you my Amazon $10 gift card? Because clearly this is not a flex, right? So why am I showing you this gift card? Well, this gift card is made of plastic. Now, plastic is it is the most prolific material on the planet. We use it for construction. We use it for our materials. We use it for clothing. We use it for cooking. We use plastic for everything. And I mean everything. Look around your house or wherever you are, and basically everything you see has plastic in it. You guys can see behind me, you can see the little air thingy on the wall. That's made of plastic. You can see the curtains behind me, plastic. The screen on my window, plastic. The computer I'm talking to you, plastic. My headphones, plastic. My sweet Amazon gift card, plastic. So that's the topic today, but why did I start with the Amazon gift card? No one's going to win it. I already cashed it in. I spent it on dog bones. So, well, part of it was, I use it all to pay for a part of the dog bones because dog bones are expensive. But I show you this because it's a good prop to highlight one particular thing about plastics is how much you consume on a weekly basis. And it depends on who you are. And some people, this is more, some people, this is less. But your average human in the United States consumes about 1 credit card, or 1 Amazon gift card in this case, of plastic per week, which I think is an astounding statistic when you think about it, right? You think this isn't heavy by any chance, but you would feel like I would remember eating, this Amazon gift card. So we're going to answer the question, how do we eat this every week without even knowing it? And what are the effects of eating this? And what are the effects of this on the environment and human health? So that's the sort of my little start off. I like to highlight that. I think it's kind of an eye opener, because it doesn't really matter who you are. This really affects you, because as you look around your rooms, you can't get away from plastic. It is everywhere. If it wasn't for wood, which is one of our other primary building materials, plastic would just blow away everything else in terms of sheer amounts. So, all right. So I don't need my face cam on, so I'm going to drop it for quality. If you have any questions along the way, definitely let me know. Let's dive into a plastic ocean. Now, this talk is titled "A Plastic Ocean" for there's two things I need to say about that title, actually, I should say. So the lens we're going to view plastics and the problem of plastics is through the ocean. Now, why are we looking through the ocean? Well, the ocean's awesome, clearly, but the ocean covers 70% of the planet. And so if something bad is happening to the ocean, you can bet your bottom dollar that that same bad thing is happening to every other ecosystem on the planet. And that is absolutely true. So while we're going to focus on the ocean and we're going to talk about human health for a bit, the topics we're discussing today are readily applicable to every ecosystem on the planet. So we're talking about the plastic ocean as a way to talk about plastics in general, not because plastics only affect the ocean. And clearly these are grotesque sights, right? No one would want to swim in the ocean if it looked like this. No one wants to see animals like this. So we're doing this because the ocean is a convenient way to talk about this problem of plastic. Now, before we begin, I just want to start off with a quick little story. Now, my stories, as you guys have probably figured out at this point in time, are not particularly very exciting. I'm just an average everyday person. But I would say I'm probably far nerdier than your average everyday person. I feel like you have to be a biologist. But when I was younger, let's say, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, I was a teenager. One of my favorite types of shows were those survival shows. So like the two in particular that I really liked was, the first one was Survivor Man. Was a guy that he would go out with his own camera and he would film. It was on Discovery Channel, so it wasn't like crappy filming or anything like that. But he would go out all by himself. He had no film crew. He'd just be all by himself for like a week in like the Arctic or wherever. That was one show I liked, and the other show I really liked was Man vs. Wild, and that's the one with Bear Grylls. I'm sure you guys probably have all heard of Bear Grylls because of all the gross things that Bear Grylls has done, like drink his own pee and eat giant bugs, or drink water out of a camel's poop or something. All the gross stuff Bear Grylls does with this camera crew for the means of survival. And I really like those shows. I don't know why. I still like them a lot. I think I just find them exciting. Maybe I just like the idea of being in nature, whatever reason. I've always liked those shows. Now, one of the things that always astounded me about those shows was that no matter where these guys went, and I mean no matter where they went, they could go to an island in the Pacific, they could go to the jungle, they could go to the Arctic. It doesn't matter where those crazy men went, they would find trash. They would find plastic. And I remember seeing that when I was younger, before I even, went to college. And I just remember how astounded I was at how big of a problem the pollution with plastic truly is. And it was just through the lens of these two guys that would drink their own pee. for as gross as that sounds, like, that was the lens I was seeing it through. And as I learned more and more and more, and as I'm going to show you guys today, it's a problem that really is pervasive across the planet. So let's take a quick detour. My dog, this is some pictures from the fall, but I like to show them to people before we talk about sad things, because we've got horrible pictures, and then we have beautiful, cute pictures here of dogs bobbing for apples. And then we'll dive back into the terrible pictures after. But I just wanted to show these off because he's a little cutie boy, and he can eat an apple whole, which I think is awesome. So all right, so this leads us to a quote. I've been on a quote kick this semester. I've been on a quote kick for a long time, actually, now that I think about it. But I like this quote. It's from the CEO of a corporation that I consistently say bad things about because they do consistently bad things. This is Nestle. Now, John Catarano is the CEO of Nestle. I'm pretty sure he still is. I can't remember if that's true or not. But in 2019, so just about 2 years ago, Mr. Caterano said the water bottle has in some ways become the mink coat or the pack of cigarettes. It is socially not very acceptable to the young folks, and that scares me. Now, if you think about the business model of Nestle, they sell a bunch of stuff, right? They don't just sell water; they sell chocolate. They sell, like other different types of food. Like Nestle owns like 30 companies. They're a huge corporation, and so, but their biggest sort of moneymaker is their water, right? Nestle's water. And it's not just Nestle, it's actually just a bunch of other brands under Nestle. So you can Google like water companies that Nestle owns, and it's a crap ton of companies. And it's like Evian, and if I'm not mistaken, it's also Poland Springs. There's lots of water companies Nestle owns across the planet. It doesn't matter what continent you're on, Nestle owns a water company in your continent, which is kind of a cool thing when you think about it from like a business perspective. But from the perspective we're thinking about it is, it's not such a good thing. Now, the CEO here says it's not acceptable to young folks. Now, I've given you guys all the credit in the world that your generation tends to be far more environmentally conscious than my generation and the generation before mine, as well as my parents' generation, so the baby boomers. And when you think about the business model of Nestle, where they're making billions of dollars off bottling water in cheap, easy to produce plastic, if your model depends on that plastic and it's unacceptable, such as mink coats or smoking tobacco, then your business model might be in a little bit of trouble. And you can sort of think about this of like this sort of quote also in the lens of the millennials and Gen Z are killing X industry, right? We're killing the chain restaurant, all those sorts of things, that they like to blame our two generations for killing. But hopefully our generation is also the generations that kill Nestle's business, the bottled water, the plastic problem. So I like this quote because it really shows you the sort of the mindset that a large corporation that sells a product based on plastic, how they view shifting mindsets against the sort of the negatives surrounding plastic. So that's our friends that's the people at Nestle. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to tackle this idea through the marine environment. Now, to date, there has been 700 species that have been documented to be negatively affected by oceanic plastics. Now, that's a small fraction of the total species pool in the ocean. I can guarantee you, without much hesitation in my voice, that pretty much every species on the planet is affected by plastics in some way, shape, or form. Just as a note. But as of today, we've scientifically documented negative effects on 700 marine species, whether it's a seal being trapped here in fishing gear, pictures that started a whole national movement with turtles getting plastic straws stuck in their nose and their mouth and their throats, or a picture you might have seen similar to, like a fish getting essentially strangled to death by plastic wrapped around its neck. So we know the effects of oceanic plastic on many, many species. And so those are just two examples, but there's this some other examples that I'll give you where we have a sea lion here essentially being choked out by a plastic bag that it got caught on its head. And then we have a picture here of a sperm whale. And this is the sperm whale. You see it's clearly very, very dead. It's cut open. There's a bunch of people working on it, and they actually cut open its gut, and you can actually look what's inside its stomach. You can see the body of the sperm whale is right here. Right, this is just on top of the sperm whale. Plastic bags, cups, lids for coffee cups. Right, that could be a Dunkin' Donuts lid for all we know. All these plastic pieces found in the stomach of this organism. Now, you might ask, how does this happen? How does this happen? How did these happen? Well, the reality is, scenes like this happen because if you're a large animal like the sperm whale, you're just eating large gulps of water at a time. And so you're likely, the bigger gulps you take, whether you're a sperm whale or right whale or any type of whale out there, big gulps means you're likely to ingest plastic and other pieces of waste floating around in the ocean. So that's one way. Now, the other thing that commonly happens, and the sea lion is a great example of this, where this bag looks like something floating in the water. It looks like a jellyfish floating in the water. And so if you're a sea lion and you eat jellyfish, like many large marine mammals do, well, that plastic bag looks like something you should eat. So you try to eat it, and then you become ensnared. And you can imagine, like, this sea lion doesn't have hands, so it's not pulling that bag off its face. So the sea lion is going to die. Unless it can get its head out of the bag, of course. But then you look at examples like this, right? This is just the organisms foraging, like swimming, doing its thing. Same here. It was swimming, doing its thing, got caught on, it's trying to swim through fishing line. It got caught, eventually leading to this. And then the same thing with our turtle, right? It's eating, it's doing its thing. It gets plastic in it. So these organisms are just doing what they're normally doing, and they're encountering this waste. And this waste looks like stuff that's supposed to be there, and they either accidentally eat it or they eat it on purpose, but they're still affecting them negatively in a wide variety of manners. So, it's kind of a weird thing to think about. Like, we look at these animals trying to eat plastic because they don't know any better, but we know better, and we're still eating plastic on a daily basis. So. Someone has their mic on. Just pop it off for me. Thank you. Thank you. So you can think about sort of the way they're doing it. They're just part of their natural lives. But then you can think about us, right? We're eating that credit card's worth of plastic on a daily basis. So where do we come in? So we'll get to that soon, but let's talk about plastic by the numbers, because it's astronomically high. And I really mean it. Like the amount of plastic just in, say, cake, those K-cups, those little pods for the coffee, just the plastic we use in those can go to the moon and back on a yearly basis. Like the numbers are staggering when we actually start to break down how much plastic there is out there. So let's take a peek. So globally, about 300 million tons, sometimes less, but generally around about 300 million tons of plastics is produced annually, which is a crap ton of plastic. 300 million tons is no joke. That's 300 billion pounds of plastic. It is a monster amount of plastic. Now, of that 300 million tons, half is what we define as single use. Now, what does single use mean? Well, if you guys were paying attention when I was sort of talking about the labs and stuff, I had my face cam on too. I got an iced coffee this morning. So I was drinking out of a plastic cup. It had a plastic straw in it. I was being bad. I don't normally do that, but I was being bad today because I was just craving a coffee, iced coffee in particular. And that cup from Starbucks has a plastic cup, plastic lid, and I had a plastic straw with it. And so once I'm done with this cup, I'm going to wash it out and I'm going to throw it in my recycling bin. And because I'm using that plastic cup and that plastic lid only once, and I'm never going to use it again, that's what we would consider single-use plastic. Now, there's a wide variety of things in the world of plastics that are single-use, and we'll get to them shortly, a much more comprehensive list, but they're things you encounter on an everyday basis. Plastic shopping bags, paper shopping bags. If you know anyone that's a smoker, their cigarette butts have plastic in them. So single-use plastic is a significant proportion of how much of the plastic we produce every year. Now, of that 300 million, around 10% or so enters the world's ocean every year. So quite a bit of our plastic makes it into the ocean. Now, of all that plastic that makes it into the ocean, only 20% comes from, like, I was already in the ocean and I put the plastic in the ocean. Like I was on a boat, a cruise line or whatever, and I put that plastic into the ocean. So only 20% comes from oceanic-based sources, right? From oil, oil derricks or boats and so on and so forth. The rest of the plastic, that millions of tons that make it into the ocean annually, 80% comes from land-based sources. So it was on land, and it wasn't thrown directly into the ocean on purpose, but it made it to the ocean in some way, shape, or form. Now, what's the most common way? Well, you can already sort of see where we're going with this. Most of the plastic that's on the land actually just makes it into our rivers. And as we discussed in the water lecture, all rivers lead to the ocean eventually. So most of the plastic in the ocean got there via a river. Now, let's look at a breakdown of the world's most polluting rivers. And you'll see we have the lower mass input here in tons per year, and the upper mass mass limit of tons per year of plastic. This is the surface catchment area and the average discharge. We don't really care about those, but you can sort of see the amount of the mass of trash that is put into the ocean. And it's pretty high just on a per ocean basis, right? 4 times 10 to the 5. That's a pretty big chunk of plastic, right? And that's just from one river. And so you sort of look through this table, you see, you have the Yangtze River, one of the largest rivers in the world. In China, the Ganges, again, one of the largest rivers in the world. In India, and you see lots and lots of other rivers. In China, we have a couple in Africa, Indonesia as in Southeast Asia in the islands. We have Brazil and the Amazon River being the longest river, one of the top 5 longest rivers in the world. And then you sort of go down, you see these actually are mostly just sort of occur in Africa and Asia. And we actually graphically just break that down. We look at that not just in terms of rivers, but we actually just look at where plastic is coming from. This is actually from data from some colleagues at Northeastern University. I don't know if I mentioned this in the first class, but I actually got my doctorate at Northeastern University, so I actually knew the people that made this graph. And you can see the mismanaged plastic in metric tons per year. You see China leads the way at close to 9 million metric tons of plastic waste per year. And then you see it drops precipitously to about 2/3 to the Indonesia, Philippines, and so on and so forth. Again, really reflecting what we saw in that previous table with, again, lots and lots of countries in Africa and Southeast Asia and Asia as a whole contributing to the plastic pollution problem in the ocean. And then down here at the tail end, we have the United States rounding out the top 20, which it's the first time. It's a good thing we're not number 1 in it, because we have a lot of plastic, but not as much of our plastic is mismanaged as it is in other parts of the world. Even though we have much larger populations in, say, Burma or Morocco or North Korea, we do a better job handling our plastics, which I guess is a kind of a good thing. So lots and lots of plastics coming via our ocean, lots of plastics coming from Asian countries. Now, what other sources of plastics are out there, right? We think of plastic as in, like, I have a coffee cup, right? Or I have a straw, or I have, I don't know, a magazine, right? Those are the sorts of plastics we tend to think about, right? But what other sources of plastics are out there? Now, there's a specialized subset of plastic, which we canonically define as microplastics. Now, I'll give you the technical definition of that later, but I think you can sort of piece together what it means. Micro meaning it's very, very small, and I can't likely see it. And then plastics as in plastic. So it's simply plastics that you cannot see. And that's all really microplastics are. And we'll talk again. I'll give you a more technical definition in a moment, but that's what microplastics are. Things you can't see, microscopic pieces of plastic, not the credit card, right? Not the plastic water bottle, not the trash bag in the sperm whale stomach. Microscopic pieces of plastic. So how do we get other sources of plastic? Well, agricultural runoff as well as aquaculture are big sources of plastics. We use lots of plastics in our agricultural setting, both on land and in the ocean. Cruise ships love, either on purpose or on accident, love to put stuff into the ocean, as do like shipping containers. They like to accidentally or purposely dump things into the ocean. People just being jackasses and just straight dumping. So like you have say you're out on your boat and you don't want to take care of your trash and you throw the trash overboard. That's ocean dumping. Stormwater runoff is a pretty common thing we see. So when you have really heavy rains, like, sort of akin to what we're having in Massachusetts this morning, that causes things to overflow, allowing trash to make it into the ocean as well. Urban runoff. So when you have rainstorms in say Boston, and there's trash on the ground in Boston, and it gets washed via runoff, rainwater into the ocean, that's what we call urban runoff. And then poor waste management really is the big issue here. How we handle our waste, as we'll talk about in 2 classes, I think, is really the big issue here. And we do a really bad job globally of handling our waste, like catastrophically bad. So plastic has a lot of avenues that the way they can make it into the ocean, but I'd like to sort of just talk about one type just for a brief moment. And it's actually from our cruise ships. Cruise ships are a sizable chunk of dumping, direct dumping into the ocean. And we'll do this from a headline. I forget where I pulled this from. It looks kind of like the text of like the New York Times, but I don't really remember where I pulled this from at this point. But in 2018, Carnival cruise lines, those big giant ship people, they actually had to pay $20 million after they pled guilty to dumping food and plastic waste into the ocean off the coast of the Bahamas. So, they're taking advantage of awesome clean waters, but then on the other hand, they're polluting them right away, which is kind of a stupid business model, if you ask me, but that's beyond the point. But they were fined $20 million for dumping large amounts of trash into the ocean. You're talking about hundreds and hundreds of thousands of homes of trash into the oceans. And they agreed to pay a $20 million fine for that dumping. Now, when you put that in the context of what Carnival made, so in 2018, they had $18.8 billion in revenue, before, taxes and all that stuff like that. That $20 million was a 0.1% of that total revenue, which is kind of awful. When you sort of think about the equivalent, that'd be like me charging you guys a penny every time you said a bad word or something like that, right? That's the level of fine that is to a company like Carnival. And when you start thinking about how large a corporation like Carnival is, a fine simply doesn't cut it, right? A $20 million fine for handling a large problem, like waste is a substantial part of their sort of overall fiscal budget for the year. It's hundreds of millions of dollars to deal with their waste every year. And if dumping is a way to cut that thing, you're more than happy to pay the $20 million price tag, right? That $20 million price tag is basically just the price of doing business, right? It's kind of included in your fiscal budget, right? And so I've always argued, and I know many people have also argued, that fines simply aren't enough, right? To deter Carnival from doing this year after year after year, which they do. A small slap on the wrist like this simply isn't enough, right? I mean, if it was a $10 billion fine, then you're talking. But clearly a $20 million fine is not going to do anything to hurt our friends at Carnival. I'm not going to call them our friends, the people at Carnival, because I'm not friends with anyone who dumps into the ocean. That's not cool. So those are our sources. That's plastic by the numbers. Now, where does plastic, what are the most common things we find? Well, this is just a really handy table from the Ocean Conservancy. This table hasn't changed at all since 2014 when I first pulled this. So I didn't see any reason to change it because, again, it hasn't changed in 7 years, which is, I guess, good for me, but bad for the ocean. But you'll notice the top 10 items found are cigarette butts. You might not think cigarette butts, they look like paper, but they actually have a sizable amount of plastic. About 40% of a cigarette butt is plastic, which sounds smoking's already gross enough, but smoking plastic sounds even grosser. Caps and lids and bottles are 2 and 3. We have plastic bags, food wrappers and containers, cups, plates, forks, and knives, plastic ones, the disposal ones you would find in, say, the cafeteria, beverage bottles that are glass, straws and stirrers. And these are just straight numbers, right? Not mass of plastic, just straight numbers. My friends, someone's got their mic on. And
those homicidal ocean warriors are the only natural marine predators of the moose. And since the moose is completely defenseless in the water, it's basically a free kill. But the real problem is that it doesn't happen often enough for the moose to recognize the water as a dangerous place.
Will, you gotta keep your mic off, my friend. I don't mind you not paying attention, but at least keep your mic off. All right. So lots and lots of things you use on an everyday basis. But you'll notice that of the top 10 items found, they're all single-use plastics, right? These are things you use once and you throw away. So the problem of oceanic plastic isn't like the plastic that makes up, say, in your car, or plastic that makes up your computer. It's stuff that you use once and throw away, stuff that is hyper pervasive, not just here, but abroad. Now, okay, so we have these large pieces of plastic, and clearly the picture of our friend, the sperm whale, had lots of plastic that you could see, but there's lots of plastic that you can't see. So how do we get plastic you can't see? How do we get our microplastics? Well, the reality is plastic breaks down. It does not decompose. Plastic breaks down. Now, what do I mean by that? Why am I making such a strong point of saying that difference? Now, breakdown is different from decompose. So when I have a sandwich and I don't finish that sandwich and I throw that sandwich in the garbage, if I come back to the garbage in 5 years, that sandwich is gone. Organisms have eaten it, recycled all the nutrients in it, and that sandwich is gone. Plastic doesn't do that. Plastic, if I threw plastic in my trash can and I left it for 5 years, I'd come back in 5 years. It might be slightly discolored, but that plastic's going to be whole in 5 years. So plastic simply does not decompose. It doesn't decompose in a 5-day time period, a 5-year time period, or as you can see here, sometimes hundreds of year time period. It doesn't decompose ever. It breaks down, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, so you eventually can't see it anymore, but it simply never goes away. Now, to give you an analogy of what this would look like, if the Pilgrims, when they came over here on the Mayflower, so, you're talking 400 years ago, right? If they had plastic bottles of Coke with them, or maybe they had a cup from Starbucks, obviously those things didn't exist, but just for the sake of the example, pretend they did. If those people had those cups with them and just left them, those would still be around today, either completely whole or broken down into teeny tiny pieces. So you're talking hundreds of years, potentially indefinitely, for this plastic to hang around in our ocean, to hang around in our soil, to hang around in our environment. So I hope I've underscored how sort of problematic plastic is, that because once it gets out there, it unless you actively take it out of the ocean, it's never going to go away. And that's what plastic does. It breaks down, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, but it never decomposes like, say, a banana peel would. Now, microplastics have a technical definition. So as you get smaller and smaller and smaller, as the plastic breaks down, a microplastic is canonically defined as being less than 5 millimeters in size. So just at the cusp of not being able to see. So very, very small. Now, when we actually start to do some math behind it, we actually come to the starting conclusion. I can send this article from the Scientific American if you're interested in it, but an article from the Scientific American based on some research actually indicated that 15 trillion tons of plastic particles are thought to be floating in the ocean alone, with most of it being microscopic in nature. 15 trillion tons. That's a lot of tons. So we have plastic. It breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces. So it starts as a Coke bottle and breaks down and breaks down and breaks down. So we can see that effects here in this rainbow runner, right? This is a picture taken by my colleague. This is fish. They caught the fish, they gutted it, and inside the gut, which is not very big, you can see the stomach here, full of plastic. So this fish's stomach was basically full of plastic that had broken down from larger pieces of plastic. And again, this fish is eating this plastic not because it's stupid, it just simply doesn't know what plastic is, right? This plastic looks like food, thus it eats it, right? If you saw an awesome Chipotle burrito hanging around and you didn't know it was anything but a Chipotle burrito, you'd want to eat it, right? Because obviously everyone here eats burritos. I'd worry about you if you didn't eat burritos, but that's what the fish is doing, right? It's eating it because it looks like food. And we can see the same thing with this copepod. But as these bits and pieces break down, this copepod, which is microscopic, it's only about 100 millimeters. It sees these pieces of plastic, it thinks they're plankton and eats the plankton as well. It eats the plastic as well. So we have very, very small organisms, much larger organisms, mistaking plastic that is broken down into either microscopic or smaller pieces. And again, plastic breaks down, does not decompose. Now, there's a whole classification of microplastics that we define as virgin microplastics, plastics that are intentionally created very, very small for industrial as well as commercial applications. And so the most common types we see are actually microbeads. And so you can actually see toothpaste here. For those guys that have used toothpaste before, I hope everyone here I don't feel like you can make it as an adult and not having used toothpaste, but hey, maybe you have. You've used toothpaste before, toothpaste has a grit to it. Does anybody stop to think what that grit is? Historically, that grit was tiny pieces of broken rock. But modern toothpaste, modern facial scrubs, modern cosmetics that have any grit to them, that grit is microscopic plastic. And that's the reality of sort of our modern industrial things, that if there's any grit to something, it's a microplastic. And it's, again, these are virgin, never used plastics that are created for a specific purpose. There are tons of applications of plastics like this. Toothpaste, facial products are just two of the most common examples that you'll run into on an average everyday basis. Now, another type is actually microfibers. So for those of you that ever worn, swishy pants, those Adidas or whatever brand swishy pants, or if you've ever worn yoga pants, have you ever worn leggings, if you've ever worn anything that's nylon, polyester, or polypropylene, they all have intentionally created virgin microfibers, microscopic pieces of fiber used in clothing to make them stronger, more stretchable, more durable. And so when you wash your pants, if you could look at the drainage water from washing your pants, your jeans, your leggings, whatever, you would see tiny bits of microfibers, virgin plastics like this, again, intentionally created small for a commercial application of clothing. So I think I like sort of these examples. They're really sort of puts an eye on what you're doing. Now, the one that actually I will make a quick mention of, because it's mentioned in the documentary, is actually lotions. Lotions have lots of plastic in them as well. They're used to help sort of the lotion make it into your hand as well. And those plastics, again, are created intentionally small, microscopic for a commercial application. So I think these are pretty cool little sort of ideas. So plastics break down, they don't decompose, but they can be created intentionally small. And when they're intentionally small, like this and this and this, they're easily washed out into our rivers and eventually into our oceans. So, yep, you had a question, Katerina?
It had said on the last slide about Obama signing the Anti-Microbead Act. Is that still in effect for US products?
Yes and no. It has to be, so during the last administration, it wasn't enforced at all. And Biden has been in office for so little amount of time that I don't think he's done anything with it. So it was signed, but if I'm not mistaken, it was an executive order, and those are easily overturned by an incoming president and are easily ignored. So yes and no, to answer your question.
Okay, I was just curious, since like we still have products that have microbeads, so I was
yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, we still got them, which is kind of an unfortunate thing. So plastics break down, they get small and small and small, right? So let's talk about two things. Well, first we'll talk about where plastics distribute in the marine environment, and then we'll talk about how the plastics go from large to small. So let's talk about where they're found. And the short answer, it's actually just a one-word answer. It's everywhere, right? The example I gave you at the start of the class with the survivor shows, plastics are found everywhere. And it doesn't matter if it's the top of the ocean, the bottom of the ocean, you find plastics everywhere. Plastics, just like the human population, is pretty heavily concentrated in coastal environments. Why? Because people live in coastal environments. Currents oftentimes bring ocean water to coastal environments. So coastal ocean zones have lots and lots of trash, lots of plastic, as you can see here. Now, plastic is found everywhere. It's found in pelagic and benthic zones, so out further into the ocean and deeper down into the ocean. They get there via our oceanic currents that we discussed, and as well as the deep currents that we discussed during the water class. And plastics, again, they are everywhere. And I say everywhere, I mean everywhere. So you can read up about this from the BBC. There's a recent study that went to the Mariana Trench. I'm sure many of you have heard of the Mariana Trench, but if you've never heard of the Mariana Trench, it's one of the many, many very deep parts of our ocean, just really, really just cut out parts of the ocean. They get very, very deep, the deepest parts of our ocean. The Mariana Trench happens to be the deepest one of them at 11 kilometers deep. And when they did a little expedition down there, you can see that at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, 11 kilometers down, they found trash, fishing gear, plastic bags, metal pieces. They found trash at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. And so when I said plastic is everywhere, I mean everywhere. Because again, it's astounding how connected our global oceans are. This plastic could be from the United States for all we know, but it ended up in the Mariana Trench. So our oceans are simply just connected with one another. I think I missed something. I feel like I missed something here. I did miss something. I forgot to mention how microplastics are created. It was on the slide, but I forgot to mention how it was created. Sorry about that. I'm just going to take a quick step back and talk about that because it's important to know how plastics break down. Now, the most common way plastics break down is actually photodegradation. So you guys probably have a general idea what that means. Photo meaning sun or light, and degradation means break down. So as the sun heats up plastic, it causes plastic to dry out, to crack, and as plastic cracks, it breaks when it's subject to forces such as the wind and the wave. So the sun does a number on plastics, causes it to crack, get smaller, start to break down. And so the sun is the most important way that plastics are broken down, but the wind and the wave in the ocean also are very, very important for creating little bits of plastic like this and eventually creating microscopic plastic such as this. So sorry that I missed that one. I jumped the gun on getting to where plastic was because I like this slide because it's like a boom sort of statement. So, okay, so we have plastics. It's everywhere. It breaks down, doesn't decompose. There's crap tons of it, for lack of a better word, of it in the ocean. It's distributed everywhere. So the question we can ask is, why do we care? Now, the pictures I've showed you thus far probably tugged on your heartstrings, but the question is, how common is that problem? And are there other reasons why we should care about plastics? So let's talk about one class one type of issue surrounding plastic, which we call POPs, or persistent organic compounds. Now, POPs are a wide variety of things. You can sort of see all these things listed under POPs, but they're basically anything that likes to bind to organic material. And organic material is not like, or I don't mean it like organic fruits or vegetables. I mean organic as in just like living tissue. So things that are persistent organic compounds like to essentially bind to living tissue, to get into living tissue. That's what makes them really dangerous. Now, in addition to being toxic to us and all life on the planet, is they actually like to stick to plastics. And they stick like Velcro, or they stick like you've applied super glue to them. Like they love to hang on to plastics until they're consumed by an organism. So let's talk about some of the classifications of things we can find on plastics. So PCBs, polychlorinated bisphenols. You hear more about those. Polychlorinated. Shoot, it's not bisphenols. I'm so sorry. I'm dropping my brain on what PCB is. Anyways, they like to bind to plastics. I'll remember it eventually, or you can Google it yourself. I'm so sorry. But heavy metals, lead, cadmium, mercury, nickel, love to bind to plastics, and those are all very toxic. We talked about Flint, Michigan in the water class, and you guys know the issue with Flint, Michigan was lead, and lead is very toxic to young children. So those things like to inherently stick to plastics. Now, we have bisphenol A, or BPA. It's actually a pretty cool compound. You'll learn a lot more about it if you watch the Disappearing Male documentary, but bisphenol A is just a classification of bisphenols. It was originally developed actually as a estrogen mimic. And so while BPA was designed to help mimic estrogen and help women with problems with estrogen and men with estrogen problems, it was actually just co-opted to be used in plastics. So BPA is really, really common in plastics, and it loves to stick to plastics. And as plastics are used more and more and more, it actually likes to break off of plastic and get into your system. So you guys probably have heard of BPA before, right? You guys probably see those BPA-free water bottles. And those are cool, and you should definitely buy ones that are BPA free if you're going to buy any plastic water bottle. But as you'll learn from the documentary, BPA is just one type of bisphenol. There's lots of other bisphenols out there. So while all the public outroar against BPA made a difference for manufacturers, there's still other bad things such as BPA out there, just to let you guys know. So the moral of the story of BPA is use metal, don't use plastic. Used for water bottles, of course. Pharmaceuticals, caffeine, Tylenol, estrogen, Advil, Aleve, any common pharmaceutical out there will actually bind to plastics. Now, you might not think that's a big deal, but acetaminophen as a compound, caffeine as a compound, was actually designed to kill organisms. We take them to get rid of pain. We take them to get, to be more productive, but caffeine and acetaminophen are very, very toxic. Pesticides, which are clearly designed to kill things, as well as insecticides, they bind to plastics. And again, very harmful if they're ingested. And flame retardants, such as our friend asbestos, do bind to plastic as well. So lots of bad things bind to plastics. And so it doesn't really matter what they are, you could sort of see it, right? Right, whether it's metal, whether it's BPA, pharmaceuticals, lots of bad things stick to plastic. And if you consume enough of that plastic, you're going to eventually get a dose that might harm your biology. And depending on how big you are, you might need less of these bad things to harm your biology. So there are direct effects of the things that stick to plastics on biology. And just to sort of show you some shellfish, shellfish here, because we have some mussels and clams and oysters here. And we can look at some of the things found in the guts of these organisms. You guys may or may not know is that these are filter feeder organisms. So they just let water come through them. That's all they do. And they filter out algae and stuff like that. And they also filter out microfibers, microplastics. And so you could see these organisms absorbing this stuff. And you can imagine if it was laced with some of this stuff, that would be detrimental to their biology. So if we start to absorb plastics, whether it's got bad stuff on it or not, what are the effects on marine organismal biology? Well, the first is, and I'm just going to go back just couple slides. If you're like this unfortunate rainbow runner and your belly is 90% full of plastic, well, you simply means you're not going to be able to absorb as much nutrients. You're not going to be able to grow as much, right? If my belly is full of plastics, I won't be able to absorb water. I won't be able to absorb food, thus leading to lower overall body mass. Now, you might not think that's a big deal, but it is, right? If you were underweight, or if you had a kid that was underweight, that's a bad thing, right? It's the same thing for marine organisms. But more importantly, if you're thinking about this from an economic sense, we think about our friends here, the oysters. We think about commercial fish, salmon, trout, things like that. If they're smaller in size because of plastics, that hurts those commercial entities, right? And so plastics cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars every year on lost revenue in aquaculture, again, just simply by reducing overall body mass. So not so good for our fishermen out there. Now, one of the things that they'll do is they actually will reduce essentially fecundity, so the capacity to produce offspring. So organisms that are exposed to plastics, they produce less offspring. Their offspring are smaller overall. You can imagine if you are chock full of stuff like this, you're going to have some internal damage potentially, and you would be right about that. If you have a stomach full of plastic, it causes inflammation, potentially tearing of your stomach, which clearly is a bad thing. And the other thing, which your lab sort of gets you thinking about, is actually this process of biomagnification. So let's talk about this. What is biomagnification? What is bioaccumulation? What happens? So if we think about what bioaccumulation means, if we have an organism as it's growing over time, if it's growing in an environment that is, say, laced with PCBs, right? I haven't remembered the name of it yet, but toxic compounds. As that organism lives and lives and lives and lives in that environment, it's going to bioaccumulate in their tissue over time. So I'm sure you guys have probably seen like closures for red tides, right? Maybe if you've gone down to the Cape, you can't catch shellfish from here, you can't swim here because of a red tide. Well, red tides are just simply a toxin released by a plankton in response to a number of different things, but it's a toxin nonetheless. And so if you have a crab that's living in waters, or a fish that's living in waters that has a red tide, the longer it stays in that water, the more that toxin accumulates in their tissue, causing the concentration to go up over time. So that's what we mean by bioaccumulates. Now, your first section of your lab, where you mix the oil and the iodine, really gets at that idea, because the mixing that occurs of these toxins is typically it gets stored in fatty tissue. That's typically where toxins get stored. That's yours too as well, just as a note. So that's what bioaccumulation is. Now, that's just an organism living and accumulating toxins over its lifetime. But the other aspect of this is biomagnification. Now, this figure does it some justice, where you see there's very, very little dark blue here, more dark blue as I go up to the food chain, more dark blue. And then finally, when I get to the top of the food chain here, there's even more dark blue. But actually, let's just use the example from your handout, your worksheet, where we have this hypothetical food chain where we have phytoplankton, zooplankton, herring, salmon, and orcas. So again, exactly the same as what's in your lab handout. Now you'll notice that the plankton is living in an environment where there's a house and there's a factory. And of course, we have urban runoff and we have dumpage from a factory into Puget Sound, so up in the Pacific Northwest. And these phytoplankton, they're at the bottom of the food chain. They're absorbing PCBs, and they only absorb a little bit, right? So you'll notice that, some of these guys don't have the red toxin, right? But some of them have picked it up. Now, these phytoplankton are then eaten by zooplankton. But as you sort of will see with your example, zooplankton have to eat a lot of phytoplankton. And so as they eat more and more phytoplankton, they're more and more likely to pick up some of these nasty compounds, and it'll be stored in their tissues. That's just kind of a detoxification that everything sort of does. Then we have our herring, which eats a bunch of zooplankton. So we get even more and more of that toxin building up in the herring. And then that's eaten by a salmon, which again, more and more toxins. And then finally, we get to the top of the food chain. We get lots and lots of toxins in our friends, the orca here. So we have this way we move up. And now why is this the case? Well, simply being that, and again, you'll see this for example, is that large things have to eat a lot of things below it. If the herring only had to eat one zooplankton, it wouldn't be such a big deal. But the herring has to eat hundreds and thousands of zooplankton over its life. So thus, it's likely to absorb more and more of these toxins. The same thing for the herring, the same thing for our friend, the orca here. The more energy you need to live, so the larger you are, simply the more concentrated any toxin in an ecosystem is going to be within your system. Now, if we think about where humans factor into this, we don't eat at the bottom of the food chain. I mean, people eat herring and people eat lots and lots of salmon. So if you think about where humans factor in, if I'm eating these two organisms, I don't think we eat orcas. Maybe indigenous people eat orcas, but I don't think you see orca at the store, as far as I know. We eat lots of these things. And so as we eat more and more and more of salmon and zooplankton, we start to accumulate these toxins as well. So the link between humans and this is actually direct, right? We eat the big things, which have lots of these not so fun things already in their tissue. So this is bioaccumulation. This is biomagnification. I will say, and I tell this every year because I have like 5 questions written around this for exams. I ask the question about these concepts every year when I have an exam. So I'm just letting you guys know now, if you didn't understand what I said, definitely ask me, because again, I always ask these on exams because they're really important. So does anybody have any questions on that before I move on? If you have any other questions after, just let me know. So now humans factor into the food chain like this. And I gave you the statistics that we're eating a credit card's worth of plastic every week. So what are the effects of human health? Now, when you watch the documentary, you'll learn a lot about plastics on male reproductive capabilities. And it's pretty severe, as you will learn. Some scientists have actually argued that because of the effects of plastic on human male biology, that we're actually heading towards extinction. We're actually going to drive ourselves to extinction because our males are going to become so infertile because of how poor our overall sperm quality is. Just to let you know. So I think the documentary, you guys will like it or maybe hate it because it's obviously not a fun thing to think about, but it is no joke. Now, the rest of the things I'm going to mention that aren't sort of associated with male reproduction are actually some up and coming research ideas. Now, plastics, as you guys probably know, are produced via petroleum, and the petroleum industry is the biggest lobby on our Congress and globally as well, not just here in the United States. So the petroleum industry has a vested interest to make sure that plastics are used and that people don't really know the negative effects of plastic on them. So as such, and it's kind of the same thing with climate change, there hasn't been a ton of research on plastics up until recently. So only within the past 15 to 20 years are we really starting to understand the effects of plastics. And we're not really seeing meaningful congressional action here in the United States on plastics even now. So we're not doing so great on research. So a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk to you today, there's lots of causal links. There's not a ton of research on it at this given time, simply because there hasn't been enough time to study it. And so on the sort of the spectrum of scientific accuracy, of like 0 scientific accuracy is like the earth is flat, and 100% scientific accuracy is like smoking causes cancer. We're like essentially past like the halfway point on that scale, heading towards of all these things I'm going to mention being more certain as opposed to being less, more hand wavy. So I just wanted to preface that we know a lot about the effects of plastic on human biology, but we don't know the full story yet. So what I'm going to mention now, lots of good research behind it, but again, there's no like smoking gun. Yeah. So just to let you know. So the big thing we're actually going to discuss is actually phthalates, but I want to make mention of our POPs, our POPs. Now, there's lots of stuff that sticks to POPs, right? Asbestos, pesticides, heavy metals. We all know those things have negative effects on human lives, right? There's no doubt that lead causes bad things, or mercury causes bad things, or asbestos causes bad things, right? And so if they have POPs on them, we know plastics can be bad. Now, let's talk about some of the direct effects that parts of plastics, in particular phthalates, or what we call plasticizers, have on human biology. Now, phthalates are pretty cool. They're classified as endocrine disruptors. Now, for those of you that aren't as up to date on human biology, an endocrine is just a hormone. Your endocrine system is just your series of hormones. Now, you guys probably know really common hormones like adrenaline, right? That induces the fight or flight response. You guys definitely know estrogen. I've mentioned it, but you probably know what estrogen is, and testosterone. But there's lots and lots of other hormones out there, including cool ones like oxytocin, right, which is produced in heavy amounts during, say, pregnancy or birth, or when you're in love or feelings of love. So hormones, there's lots of them out there. You guys have heard of a few of them, but basically hormones do everything in your body. They're long distance signalers. So if you mess with hormones, you can mess any number of different things. And these phthalates do disrupt your hormone system. And as you guys probably know, if you disrupt your hormones, it affects growth, it affects metabolism. As you'll see from the documentary, it affects reproduction. It has also been linked to disruptions of early development, both in the womb as well as outside of the womb. And there's some indications there is linkages between ADHD as well as autism and the exposure to too much plastics. And then finally, there's a whole laundry list of things that plastics have been linked to, including diabetes, insulin resistance, breast cancer, obesity, and the list goes really, unfortunately, on and on and on. So lots of things have been linked to plastics. Again, none of it right now is a smoking gun, like smoking causes cancer, but it's heading towards that level. And we're really, really recognizing the negative effects on human health. And it's not really a good picture right now. So the moral of the story is it affects marine life by choking them out, but it also affects them by poisoning them with things they don't like. And it really has the same effect on us as well. So now, we've sort of discussed how marine organisms, they accidentally consume these things or they swim into them. But how are you getting your plastic in you, right? How are you getting your credit card a week of plastic, right? So that's the question we're going to try and answer now. Now, one of the most common ways people actually get their plastic is actually via their drinking water or their drinking habits. So this is just a nice little handy dandy figure from our friends at Forbes. I'm sure you guys probably, you guys are business folk. You probably like Forbes. I like Forbes. It makes some pretty good graphics for scientific people too. In this study by Forbes, and it was done with Statista, they actually found that of the 259 bottles that they sampled across 11 brands, they found microplastics in 93% of all drinking water. This is plastic. This would be exactly the same thing if we looked at, say, soda. If we looked at seltzer, anything that comes in plastic or something that's plastic lined, say like a can, or you went to Starbucks and you got a cup of, say, a iced caramel macchiato, which is my favorite drink to get, you get a dose of plastic. Now you might ask yourself, how does this plastic get in there? I'm not seeing bits of plastic floating around in my Starbucks cup. Well, remember, all plastics break down. And so if you have a bottle of Nestle water and it gets exposed to the sun at all, or even if it doesn't get exposed to the sun, say it's just jostled around in a truck, that causes tiny bits of plastic to break off and get into your cup. If you think about hot beverages heat up plastic, cause it to break and crack, releasing little tiny bits and pieces into your beverage cup, allowing you to drink those things. So your drinking habits certainly influence your things. this is by far one of the most common ways people ingest plastic is just via what they're drinking. Now, the other way people consume plastic, and it's probably pretty obvious, is actually just your food. The way your food is packaged. Food that's packaged in plastic containers picks up little bits of plastic. Food that is stored in like plastic containers, like say you go to Olive Garden and you get a chicken parm or something, and you didn't eat all of it, and they put it in a plastic container for you. It's all nice and warm, and mildly delicious because it's Olive Garden and it's good but not that good. The heat of your chicken parm causes the plastic to break down. Plastic gets into your food. You wrap your food in, say, shrink wrap at the end after the end of the night. Plastic gets in the shrink wrap into your food. So your food and your drinking habits are certainly two very, very common ways that plastic gets into your body, that contributes your credit card of plastic a week. But also remember, it's in common things you use. Your toothpastes, lotions, hair products, and all those plastic pieces that are in the things you use every day, they have to go somewhere. So think about when you rub your lotion into your hands, right? I'm sure most of you probably put lotion on your hands. You rub that lotion into your hands. If that lotion has plastic in it, where is that plastic going? It just doesn't evaporate. It actually just goes into your skin. So those are the three ways. Your choices of products, your food, and your drinks all determine your balance sheet of one credit card of plastic per week. So people that drink a lot of bottled water get a lot more plastic. So if for instance, my mom, I like to poke on my mom when I talk about plastics because she's awful with her bottled water drinking habit. She's to the point where she basically does not drink tap water. She will never drink tap water because I don't know. I don't know why. She's just weird. But my mom pretty much only drinks bottled water. I drink basically no bottled water, or basically I try to avoid most bottled drinks in general. And so her concentration of plastics, I'm sure, is significantly higher than my concentrations of plastic, again, because of her drinking habits. So I just to poke at my mom because she's not here or anything, but it's always fun for me to poke at my mom because everyone knows your mom is always a big pain in the butt. Am I right? So that's the way we get plastics. Lots in our bottles. Now let's talk about one particular avenue of plastics, and you guys probably remember this from a few years ago. Was celebrities like Tom Brady, Starbucks, big corporations like Starbucks and Disney, all were shunning plastic straws. And Tom Brady, you can think, if you're a New England person or a non-New England person, you can think whatever you want about him, but he did have this whole little thing on his Instagram about him and his wife about beating plastic pollution. And it all got started because people got an uproar about what he's holding: plastic straws. Now, plastic straws are single-use plastic. They're in the top 10 in terms of total number, but by total mass, they actually account for only about 0.03%. And I don't mean like 3%, I mean 0.03% of total plastic waste by mass. So not a huge contribution to the global plastic problem at all. And you might ask yourself, well, why is Tom Brady and Disney and Starbucks all shunning plastic? Well, it actually started, and this girl just made a mistake, and no one should be mad at her or anything, because frankly, she did a good thing. That she actually had a term paper that reported 500 million straws were consumed daily. That number is simply just inaccurate. And so that got people all up in stink because this term paper got picked up by the news, and it got picked up by bigger news, and eventually got picked up by Tom Brady. And then companies try to get some points for banning straws, which is how you get Starbucks and Disney involved. Now, so numerically, there's lots of straws out there, not 500 million a day, but certainly a lot of straws. And as a total percentage of mass, not that big a deal. So why am I saying this little girl did a good thing? Well, the reality is straws are really sort of prolific. And if you can get someone to think about straws and not using straws, well, maybe you can get that person to also think about not using a plastic cup, not using that Nestle water bottle. And so a lot of people see plastic straws as actually gateway plastic. Basically, they see it as potential catalysts for us to solve the problem of plastic, at least partially. We can actually see the effects of this. And so before you guys were born, there was this huge stink in the 90s around dolphin-safe tuna. Now, dolphins they're pretty awesome, really intelligent organisms, but like most marine mammals, if there's fishing nets out there, they'll get stuck in them. And again, it's not because dolphins are stupid. They're one of the smartest species on the planet. They just get stuck in them because if you're swimming 30 miles an hour through the ocean, it's really easy to get stuck in a net. And so in the 90s, there was this huge uproar because a bunch of people had reported that tuna that you could buy in a can on the shelf had a lot of dolphin in it, or that lots of dolphins were being killed by fishing nets. So there was this whole campaign in the United States about getting our nets and our fishing habits for tuna to be safer for dolphins, and it actually worked pretty dang well. So you don't really see it anymore on cans, but cans back in the 90s used to say dolphin safe tuna on them because people made such a big stink about dolphins being killed that it caused the entire industry shift away from what they were doing in response to this uproar. It was a decision based on capitalism, right? If we don't make this shift, we might lose a lot of customers. And so they made the shift. And potentially, our straws might be that catalyst. It hasn't happened yet, but maybe in the future it might be, because people start thinking about plastics, start thinking about the role plastics play in their life, and maybe that shift might happen. So this wouldn't be a Bentley class if we didn't talk about some business aspects of plastic. And so the first one we're actually going to talk about is actually from a Danish inventor, Boyan Slot. He's Danish. I'm sure that's probably not how you say his name, because Danish is really, really hard and they say weird things, but that's his name. I'm going to say it's Boyan Slot. It's probably something different, but he's an inventor. He's Danish. That's what he looks like. He has a company called Ocean Cleanup. It's a nonprofit, and he's trying to essentially clean up the ocean with technology, which is a pretty cool thing. Now it's a nonprofit, but it's still a business, so he gets money for it, right? So he has a business around trying to clean up the ocean. And so if you want to sort of see what that looks like, you can sort of look at, it's very, very simple, but you can see the sort of the amounts of plastic that they're pulling in from just a very basic thing. Again, trying to take a problem, plastic pollution in the ocean, and develop a business around it to try to solve it. Now, his goal was to actually get rid of or almost completely eliminate what we call the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Now, remember back from our class when we looked at oceanic currents, there's an entire current that goes around the ocean, the Pacific Ocean in particular. And so this entire area, which there's basically in the Pacific Ocean, where there's basically no meaningful current. As such, plastic and waste, as you can see here, actually just builds up in this part of the ocean, creating this monstrous, like size of Texas, monstrous patch, which we call the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And so his goal was to try to tackle this great garbage patch. And it's pretty cool. You can take a peek at it here. It's not a very exciting video, just kind of shows you what's going on. I'm sorry, you can sort of see what's going on here. You can sort of see what's going on. But a lot of people also say that what he's doing is not really effective, right? The garbage patch is one thing, and it's a great thing he's doing it. But as we discussed, remember, most of our plastic makes into the ocean via rivers. And so there are people, and you can take a peek at this, of using tackling river cleanups at the mouth of rivers, removing plastics before it makes it into the ocean. Pretty cool video. It's like 6 minutes long. Take a peek at it when you have a moment. So that's those sort of two opportunities, right? Starting businesses around solving the plastic problem. But the other aspect to that is to actually try to turn a profit, right? And this is where a company called 4Ocean comes into, and there are other companies like 4Ocean out there that basically try to take oceanic plastic and recycle and other plastic trash and fishing netting and making a product from them. And so I like this quote from the founder of 4Ocean. He says, as a for-profit business, we're able to give ocean trash a monetary value and incentivize people all over the world to change their behavior. That's how we clean up the ocean and drive the actions and policies that will prevent trash from entering it in the first place. And I really like that quote, because we know that if there's ever a problem, it's best solved when it's monetarily incentivized to fix it, right? The vaccination, the COVID vaccination that was developed in less than a year, huge monetary incentive to develop it. But without that huge monetary incentive, vaccine production is actually at an all-time low. New vaccines, of course, I should say. So when there's money to be made, people will jump in and find ways to make money off those problems. And so when people like 4Ocean, people like our friends at Ocean Cleanup, start to find ways to start businesses and make money. It's a potential avenue to fix the problem, but clearly it's a problem that needs to be adjusted, not just from a business perspective, because private businesses or nonprofits simply cannot fix all the problems. It does take not just regional or governmental action from a place like the United States, but it takes global action to really fix a problem as serious as global plastic pollution. So before we break for the day, I just want to make mention of a couple of things that you'll probably find interesting. So the first will be actually Bentley's recycling. Bentley recycling is pretty good. I've taught at pretty much, I don't know, I'll say 60% of the colleges in the Boston area, BU, Northeastern, and so on and so forth. And of all the places I've taught, Bentley actually has the best recycling and sustainability plan that I've seen, which you guys should be very proud of, that you go to Bentley and you contribute to this sustainability mission. So you should give yourselves a little pat on the back. But let's talk about recycling at Bentley. What should you be doing when you're on campus? Well, Bentley is single stream. You guys probably have heard single stream before, but single stream means you could take glass, plastic, paper, anything, toss it in one bin, and the recycling people will hold on to it. They'll take care of it for you. So you don't need to worry about separating things or anything like that. However, while Bentley recycles most stuff, most plastics and glass and so on and so forth, there is one particular item, actually two particular items that are no-goes. So the first is actually number 6 plastic. And so you guys have seen, when you look at plastic, you'll see the little triangle with the number in it. That's simply the recyclability, not score, that's the wrong way to say it, but it's simply the recyclability number. It tells the recycling plant what type of plastic your plastic thing is made out of. So a number 1 is a different plastic than number 6. That's all that means. Now, Bentley doesn't take number 6 plastic. And so if you're using red Solo cups, which are totally only used for not fun things, right? It's only used for serious things, our red Solo cups. You should not throw those red Solo cups into the recyclables at Bentley because they are simply not accepted. So when you're doing serious things with your red Solo cups, throw them in the regular trash. Now, the other thing Bentley's recycling plant does not like is actually contaminated food. So don't throw away chip and candy wrappers or straws or dirty things simply because they're considered what's called contaminants. So if the recycling company sees dirty food, so pretend you have your Starbucks cup and you're tired of it and you throw it into the recycling bin, it's half full. It contaminates the entire lot of plastics with your Starbucks coffee. They're simply going to look at that bag. It's way too dirty, and then they're just going to throw it in the landfill, and you basically just ruin an entire recycling thing at Bentley. So make sure your stuff that goes in there is clean, and make sure you don't put chips and candy wrappers and straws and plastic bags in there, or styrofoam, or plastic utensils, or these hot and cold beverages. If you get a wicked sweet cup of coffee at Dunkin' Donuts, make sure that goes in the regular trash. And so Bentley does a good job, but when you're recycling at Bentley, make sure you recycle right. And that's sort of the gist. Now, let's move to your individual life. What can you do? What can you do? Well, a couple things. Now, it's mostly about your choice. Now, there's lots of things you can do individually, but as with most of the things we talk about in this class, plastics is a huge, huge problem. And so it's really a governmental thing. But we can make some changes in our own lives that do help the plastic problem a little bit. So the question is, what should we use? Well, when you're shopping at the grocery store, if you do that, make sure you bring reusable bags, right? That being said, you want to make sure when you're using bags, you actually want to try to use more sustainable bags as much as you can. Simply because the amount, if you buy a cloth bag or even buy, say, a plastic bag, it's pretty intensive from a greenhouse perspective to produce those. And so just as a note, when you're buying bags, try to buy sustainable bags. There are many brands out there, but again, try to limit the amount of plastic bags you use. I know they're great to just use and then throw away, but again, reusable bags are the way to go. Now, paper bags are not a good substitute. They are biodegradable, because they're made of paper, but they do have plastic in them. So try to limit your paper bags as well. But the real big deal is just limiting your single-use plastics as best you can, right? Trying to use less plastic bags, trying to use less bottles, less trips to Starbucks as much as you can. That's sort of what you do individually. right? That's sort of things you can do. But in terms of the health effects, the big thing is you want to limit how much your plastic is exposed to extreme conditions. And when I say extreme, I mean freezing temperatures. So, when you have something in the freezer, try to limit its exposure to plastic as much as you can. So if you buy some, say, chicken at the grocery store, take it out of the little styrofoam thing it comes in, wrap it in aluminum foil, and then stick it in the freezer, again, to limit the exposure time of the chicken to the plastic, thus limiting your potential exposure to the plastics that broke off from the container. Conversely, if you have a hot dish, right, try to either ask for a paper packaging as opposed to plastic packaging when you take it home, again, to limit how much of that warm food or warm beverage causes the plastic to break down, thus how much you consume in terms of plastic. So there are things you can do in your average everyday life, but the sort of the key thing, again, with most of the problems we discussed in this class, there needs to be large changes in the way we handle our waste, large policy changes in the way we produce and recycle, and all these things. So there's lots of things you could potentially do, but again, this is such a monstrous global problem. It does require much more than individual to intervene, because the large companies like Nestle and so on and so forth have been passing the buck to us in terms of how to recycle these things for years. It's really time to put a major policy in place that forces people like Nestle or, say, Apple to recycle their own plastics, reuse them, as opposed to getting brand new plastics. So before we the final thing I just want to make mention is some pretty cool pieces of research that have come out recently about plastics. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. So let's talk about the cool stuff. So this is this first one I grabbed. This headline. There's a brand new one actually that came out a few days ago. I didn't change the slide because it says the same thing, but there's been some brand new genetically engineered bacteria and fungi that actually can start to break down plastics. And so they basically have been engineered with some pretty cool metabolic pathways, and they actually work in a pretty easy way. So what they do is, the first thing is they form a biofilm. And everyone knows what a biofilm is. You just didn't know what it was called. And so I'll give you two examples of what a biofilm is. The first one is, say you wake up in the morning, you brush your teeth, and you go out the door, you eat food and you drink stuff all day, and you say you come back at midnight because you had a long day of tennis practice or whatever, or school or whatever you're doing. And you get home and you're getting ready to brush your teeth, and you run your tongue over your teeth, and it's all grimy and gross. There's like a little layer on it. What that is just a biofilm of bacteria. Now, the other example I'll give you, if you've ever been in a river and you've slipped on a rock because the rock was super slippery, that is also a biofilm of bacteria. Now, what that is just a biofilm is just a bunch of bacteria living on top of one another. So it creates that grimy surface on your teeth, and it creates that super slick surface on a rock in a river. And so in this process, these bacteria form a biofilm on plastic, both large and small, so microscopic and macroscopic. And they form this biofilm. They do their metabolism, and they break it down, producing smaller compounds that either completely escape into the atmosphere as CO2, or actually can be used by other bacteria. So they take this undigestible product, this non-decomposable product, and they actually decompose it. So it's a pretty cool thing. As a note, it's not, at this point in time, it's not really I guess ready for prime time. You can imagine, like, if we have a huge problem of plastics in our ocean, and how big our ocean is, we would need gargantuan amounts of these bacteria to get rid of this plastic problem in the ocean. So clearly not an idea ready for prime time at the moment, but might be a potentially good thing for bioremediation in, say, industrial settings or in our trash and our landfills. That might be a better use of this technology. So pretty cool thing. And there's one thing I'll make mention of this as well. There's actually a species of worms that they actually know will eat plastic as well. So there are some natural biological systems that can get rid of our plastic. But again, at this point in time, we're not quite there to fix the problem with our bacteria or stuff like that. Now, there's been some pretty cool studies, and I say cool from a scientific standpoint. They're probably more frightening than they are cool at this point. So there's this really large study that surveyed the tissues of 6,000 participants. You can read about it here. It's a pretty cool article. But they found tissue in every human tissue studied, which when you have a study that's as large as that, it's pretty concerning. And I mean tissues, I mean like, skin and fat and, genitalia and all these different types of tissues. They found plastics in all of them. That's fun. Another pretty large study actually came to the conclusion with some pretty cool math models and some pretty cool looking at some baby bottles, is that babies globally are likely consuming about 1.5 million pieces of plastic daily, microplastics, of course, via bottle feeding. And they came to this conclusion by actually just looking at a single bottle brand that actually 82% of the world uses, which is crazy. And again, that's how they come to that 1.5 million pieces, which is quite a bit when you consider how small babies are. Right, things like heavy metals, things like asbestos affect small organisms far more harshly than large organisms. So if you think about if you had a little baby brother, that's not the best thing for him. And so that is some pretty cool off the press research. There's lots and lots of stuff. I could go on and on and on research about plastics because it comes out all the time. Again, it's truly astounding how much we're learning on an average everyday basis about plastics. So in response to that, what I'd like for you guys to do, and I will create the discussion board in just a minute. I'm going to create a discussion board about plastics. It's an optional one, so you don't have to do it. But if this sort of idea of plastics interests you, or if you saw an article that interests you, like maybe this one or the video, or maybe this one or something like that, if they really interest you, I'm gonna create a discussion board. You can read it, give me a quick summary of the piece, and tell me what you think about it. What does this mean to you? Does this scare you? Is this weird? Like, does it not make sense? And anything you think about the article. Now, it could be something you find in this talk. There's a bunch of articles linked, or maybe you want to find something on your own. It's up to you, but I will create the optional discussion board for you guys. Do you want to tackle that? Tell me what you think. I'm always excited to hear what you guys think, especially about this topic, because it's such a widespread and I'm not widespread, but it's such a impactful talk because of how pervasive plastics as a idea are in our society. So, but with that, that's going to be the end of today's class. So let me stop recording because we don't need to record